Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna work again with the Masdevallia Orchid. This time we need to repot her because, well, as you can see, she's starting to recoup, she's starting to look a lot better. Obviously, the semi-hydro experience was not for her in this environment. I went with the bark medium that already I told you so many times, it's not the best of quality and it's starting to break down, smells pretty bad. And at the top it doesn't look that way, but at the bottom, oh my. So whether I like it or not, I need to repot it. Might as well do something more functional. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I unpotted the Howeara lava burst from this self-watering pot from Lechuza because there were so many algae at the top. The top root tips were actually getting suffocated and I wanted to try out the Repot Me mix. But inside the pot, the actual moss was looking really good. It wasn't breaking down, it didn't have algae, it looked pretty fresh after quite a few months of growing that way. If you search the literature on Masdevallias, you will learn that sphagnum moss is actually the foolproof type of medium for these orchids. Of course, you need to maintain it fluffy and airy, they're still epiphytic. So I wanted to transfer this orchid to moss anyway, now that I need to change the setup. Why don't I transfer it into this Lechuza self-watering pot, since Masdevallias need to stay moist all of the time anyway. So that is what we shall do today. I'm gonna clean up this pot because why do things now when you can do them later? And I will put her in sphagnum moss. I talked about the sphagnum moss that I use is pure New Zealand sphagnum moss, or at least it claims to be from Best Grow. I really like it, it's really fluffy, and I do feel like it's not gonna break down way too fast. And at the top, to resolve the little issue with the algae, I will be putting a top layer from the Repot Me mix, you know, the bark mix, because it is very fine. I believe the roots will poke through and just find their way to the moss. I think everything will be okay. Since this pot is not transparent, we will not have algae inside, and with the top layer, no algae on the top, hopefully either. So with that said, I'm gonna go wash the pot and unpot the Masdevallia and we'll get to work. Okay, so I washed my pot. One thing I wanted to mention is the wick. I'm choosing to reuse the wick. You can choose to put another wick. The problem with these Lechuza pots is that they have very narrow holes for the wick. It's a little bit of a hassle to put the microfiber in, but I'm using a bathroom detergent, or actually cleaner, to wash all of the pots, and also I washed and actually soaked this little wick as well. I disinfected it. I'm pretty good. If I would have had a more problematic orchid in this pot, probably for my peace of mind, I would go and look for this type of material and create another wick. Anyway, that's just a side thing. Let's see how the Masdevallia is actually doing inside this pot. I think I had a few roots on this orchid. I think we'll find some leca in there as well. I just don't know how many roots are still alive. Oh dear, look at this. Look at this. Look how broken down this is. Oh my goodness. Okay, this is seriously not okay. This is what was smelling so bad. All right. Okay, so apparently we have a few divisions here, and we do still have some good roots as well. I think the leca, yeah, the leca is somewhere at the bottom. The roots that had the leca, I don't feel like they're alive anymore. But here we go, we do still have a few live roots. They're just on the verge of actually being suffocated, that's how I would call it. So I'll go wash a little bit these orchids, clean up my little table, and come back with the moss. And we're back. I washed the pot and I've also treated my little Masdevallia against spider mites. I'm in the process of actually spraying everybody. While it's still kind of warm outside, I want to do the maintenance spraying. Twice a year I want to get into the habit of actually spraying all of my collection. And now, since we're going into winter and spraying will be a little bit more risky, I just want to do it now. So that's why the Masdevallia is wet. Here I also have my sphagnum moss. It is already damp. It's watered with osmosis water and has some perlite. So I'm gonna place a layer of sphagnum moss on the bottom, and then I will hold my little orchid pretty centered, or as centered as possible, and just add sphagnum moss around it, trying to maintain the level. This is a pretty tiny orchid, and in front of me I have the camera, so it's a little awkward to do. Reason why I usually don't talk when I do these things. Okay, so I had to go off camera and finish this up. Here comes the fun part. As you can see, I did leave quite a level here. I didn't put sphagnum moss all the way to the top because we are going to be filling that layer up with the Repot Me Mix Imperial Mix for Oncidium orchids. This is a very fine mix, and I think it will do just great as a top layer. If I would use bigger bark chips, it would pretty much bury the plant. I had this happen with my Phragmipediums. I was not happy with it, and also I would not be able to make a really nice and proper layer. But with this bark, which is tiny, I can fill in the gaps. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish up. I'm gonna put this mix wherever I see the sphagnum moss poking up a little bit. If there are a few strains here and there poking, that's okay. All I wanna do is prevent a massive algae accumulation. And I think that's about it. I used only a little bit of medium, and at this point, if we wouldn't actually have a Lechuza pot, we would wonder, how will we know if the orchid is dry? Because we cannot see the moss. The bark at the top will dry out, that's for certain, but it will not mean the entire pot will be dry. Well, if you would do this in a conventional self-watering pot, or actually a Lechuza or whatever, without a gauge or a visual representation of the water level, obviously, this is absolutely not functional or not practical. You would need to have X-ray vision or be very, very, very experimented with orchids. And even if you are, and you would know instinctively, just by looking at the orchid, that she could use a little bit of water, with Masdevallias, it's really better not to play around with the moisture level. They are very finicky orchids, especially if you don't have the perfect conditions for them. That's why I actually went with this pot, because it has a gauge. So let me show you what the gauge is for. Well, it's pretty obvious. It is a visual representation of the water level in the reservoir. But it does more than tell you how much water you should put into the pot. It has a maximum level at the top. It also tells you when the reservoir is empty, when the orchid needs some water, particularly with Masdevallia, which doesn't need to dry out in between waterings. So we don't really need to see, is the medium completely dry? Is it almost dry? No, all we need to do is make sure that the gauge is not all the way to the bottom. Masdevallias need to be wet all of the time. I think there might be some species which tolerate a little bit of drying out, but as far as I've seen with experienced growers, they're actually never allowed to go dry. So the gauge will tell us pretty much if the medium is dry or not, and we don't need to mess around with how dry it is actually. All we need to do is keep it wet. And pretty much that's why I went with the self-watering pot with the sphagnum moss medium. Typically Masdevallias are repotted every year if they're grown in sphagnum moss, and even if they're grown in bark, because they're wet all of the time. Obviously, the better quality the materials, the more it will last. As you saw with that medium, this orchid lasted 2 months, 3 months, and I had to repot it. That's not okay. It's really not okay to repot an orchid every 2 months, especially something like Masdevallias. Also, I decided not to go with full bark because it would not work so well with self-watering. And for something that needs to stay wet all of the time, it would be a hassle to maintain it that way in bark, particularly in my environment. Also, bark will deteriorate pretty fast as well, being that it will be wet all of the time, and removing bark from the roots is a hassle in comparison to moss. So for all of these reasons, I decided to go for this setup rather than a different one. A few more ideas before we wrap it up. I decided not to put pebbles or anything of the sorts because I have experience with that actually. A year and a half ago, I was trying to put pebbles at the top so we don't get the burned roots or sensitive roots situation. And they worked. The problem was the pebbles that I found were pretty heavy, and some roots had issues just finding their way. And they actually took too long until they reached the medium and the moisture, and not ideal, especially with something like Masdevallias. That's why I didn't go for the pebbles. You could find lighter weight pebbles that can work. I think Repot Me has it. I think I saw it there, but I think you can find it at DIY stores or construction stores. Tiny little pieces that you can put as a top layer, and it just became very apparent to me in the past few days that most orchids that came from shredder in moss had a top layer of what I presume to be granite. So there we have it. And the pot was actually not super heavy. I think the purpose was to avoid the algae situation, probably. So there we have it, epiphany time, mind blown. Anyway, you can actually go for something like that. Perlite, I would not suggest it because perlite actually attracts algae and becomes a green mat of algae. And leca, well, I'm trying to avoid leca, so that's why I didn't put leca. And I think that's about it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Fingers crossed, wish me luck. I'll keep you guys up to date. And you know the drill, like or dislike this video below, subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and other orchid related subjects. And if you like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on notifications for my channel. Also, if you're interested in my other setups and what products I do use on a regular basis with my orchids, just expand the description. I list everything there. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!